The last session for our time together today is building an intergenerational church. And I realize that in some cases, again, I've mentioned this a couple times, that you may be thinking you don't have that authority or you don't have that responsibility or whatever. But au contraire. And I think that we can go home and be motivated about this because it's just the right thing to do and it makes sense. And I believe that if we want our kids to grow up and go on for God, that it's imperative, that it's essential, as I put on the book title. So I want to talk with you about that. It is basically more ideas, more practical stuff, and there's a lot that I need to cover. And so I am going to go rapid fire through some sections. And so, yeah, look at the resources. You're welcome to download the PowerPoint and fill in the blanks if that's important to you or whatever. And so, yeah, let's dig in. One of the books that I read, which I think is pretty motivational on this topic, is a book that's called Together. Adults and Teenagers Transforming the Church. Jeff Baxter, a guy that I've gotten to correspond with over the last couple of years, has said this: the field of youth ministry exists because churches recognized that adolescence was a unique phase of development, makes sense, with good intentions, and recognizing that teenagers need special attention. Churches began segregating teens to their own classrooms, away, and all that's great, away from adults and children. That starts to get weird. And then they hired individuals whose specific job it was to spend time with teenagers. Before long, age-specific program became the norm. Not just on Sunday mornings, but throughout the life of the church. On one hand, it makes sense. And yet it has fueled a great deal of dysfunction, and it has maybe created a church within a church type atmosphere where kids then don't like big church and don't work with the transition into big church very well. And I know we need to think that through, and we're not going to solve anything, but what I want to talk with you about this morning is how do we build intergenerational connections. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some quick ideas, and then we're going to talk a little bit of a parenthesis, if you will, and talk about the advantages, because I don't want us to leave today without you understanding my heart, and that is there are several advantages to youth ministry which I think can be implemented into the life of the church. We'll talk about that, and then we'll come back and we'll finish off with more like, well, what do we do now? And so that's kind of the strategy for today. First of all, let me again remind you of the notebooks that I handed out. If you will look, first of all, on page 20 in the notebook, there is a chart there that has some rough ideas on one generational ministry, multi-generational ministry, but also then intergenerational ministry. And then later on, when we get to the parentheses, if you will, in the notes, then that chart is on page 25 and 26. And I'll try to highlight that when we get to that section as well. Okay, but what do we do now? Let's just talk about that as we get started. And I mentioned this kind of flippantly last night, and I don't mean to be flippant, and I want to highlight this because I get asked this everywhere I go, and that is, Mel, what do we do? And so honestly, I think what you do is if God has put a burden on your heart for intergenerational ministry, then go home and start old and start young. I believe that. In other words, I think your realm of influence is certainly going to be young. And so encourage your young people to let no man despise your youth, but build relationship with senior citizens. Show them that you care. Show them that they are valued. Show them that you are listening to their voice. All of those things, that they're not out to pasture, that they have value. But also, I think, utilize your influence at home, and that is take advantage of opportunities to start old. And here is where I would start, and that is motivate and train adults to pray for emerging generations. And I honestly, that is, be intentional, be specific, be explicit, or it won't happen. Honestly, it won't. And here's what not to do first. And that is go home and stand up when you make announcements in the morning service and say, hey, listen, old people, you need to pray for the kids. No, that's not it. That's like coming up to your church and say, God bless the missionaries. Well, who are you talking about? Let's be more specific than that. And so, in other words, go to them and challenge them specifically. Take a few moments wherever it is that they meet. Probably your church has some kind of senior citizens something or other. And I would say start there and go talk with them and encourage them by name to pray specifically for younger people in your church. And notice one thing before I get off this and fail to notice this, and that is on my slide I highlighted for and then underlined that. I don't think it starts, that's down the line a little bit, that what you do is you go home. Please hear me on this. I don't think that what you do is you go home and say, what I'm going to do is schedule an intergenerational prayer meeting and get them to pray with each other. That will probably be too much of a threat to start there. Now, I'm going to talk to you about that. And I've been in some cool intergenerational prayer meetings. But in the beginning, that might be too much of a threat. And rightfully so. There is an intimacy in prayer. And let's be honest enough to admit that it may not be well done. It may not be what you want originally. Is that fair to say? And I'll talk with you more about that in a moment. But pray for emerging generations. So here's what I'm suggesting. Go to the senior citizens class and beg whatever it is you have to do. And that, I'm not kidding you. I was in one church that they honestly, I'm not sure even how I feel about it. I'm just going to tell you. They paid senior citizens to pray. I'm not sure I would do that, but the church did. It was kind of like the widows on the list thing in 1st, 2nd Timothy. But they did. They had them come. They had the old ladies come to the church, and they gave them a stipend to sit in a room and pray. I thought that was a little weird, but I was in a church that did that. I was in one church. I think this is the coolest idea, and I think I put the idea in the book, that the youth pastor in this one church actually made up baseball cards of every kid in the youth group. I love that idea. And with a digital camera and had the picture and gave the baseball cards, went to Staples or Office Max and bought those card things and printed them on the printer. And the day I was there, it was really, really cute. The senior citizens I'm not kidding you, they were doing like, I'll trade you one senior for 2 freshmen. It was really cute. And I have been in other churches that give them a list. Here's a list of all the teenagers, or here's all the list of the incoming 7th graders, or here's a list of all of the graduating seniors, and here's where they're going to go to college, and here's their address in college. Send them cookies, send them a care package or whatever, or write them a note every so often. Send them money. What a great idea. And those kinds of things. But be specific. What don't do is go home and say, pray for the kids. But give them names. And it is amazing. Did you ever go to a different church and start praying for missionaries you don't know? And then by the time you meet them, you feel like you know them because you've been praying? Honest to goodness, this is bigger than you think. And that is by praying for somebody specifically. And honestly, you're going to have to do the work on this. And that is, God will put a burden on the senior citizens for the kids, that because that's what happens with prayer. That is absolutely amazing. So what do you do first? Honestly, go home and get the oldest people, the people who have walked with God the longest, and get them to pray. It will be revolutionary if they're praying. It will, if they're praying specifically for emerging generations. Number 2, make sure, this is imperative as well, give adults specific opportunities to see younger generations actively living for the Lord. To see. Let no man despise your youth, but be an example. I've said this is, I think, the 3rd time. That cannot happen in a vacuum. There has to be an example. There has to be exposure. One of the things that I love when Tim Augram was a youth pastor, and he had me in to speak, and I spoke at his church, And one of the things that he did, when Tim was a youth pastor, he actually taught the senior citizens Sunday school class. Well, I mean, it was amazing. But every quarter, I think, in Sunday school, he would take his senior citizens, ask him about this sometime. He would take his senior citizens on a field trip to the youth department and have them stand in the back, no kidding, during the worship. And in the beginning, he tells the story, and I was there, I met some of his old people and stuff, that they didn't like the music, they didn't like the drums, they didn't like the guitars. But after a while, they began to see the teenager's heart. And then the church went through a building program and wanted to build a new youth room with a stage and sound system and all of that. The senior citizens were the ones that gave all the money for that. Because the senior citizens, the ones who were against the music, because they realized the heart. I am a big fan, if there's anything that you can do to give your kids exposure to big church and show big church, what we're doing here is getting kids living for God. I am a fan of things like youth night service, although I think the danger is you have the kids up front and they do their little show and sit down and people say, isn't that cute, or people hate it. So I would rather do that on a regular basis. I think it's essential. One Church, Four Generations book by Gary McIntosh. Have young people and white hair people in the worship team, in the visible positions. But whatever you do, show the church that we have kids here who love God and are serving God and are passionate about God. That is huge, and it is amazing how that works and how Paul was right. That young people can be an example in specific areas, but that can't happen in a vacuum. I was in a church not too long ago. In fact, Tim and I were traveling and talking about this, and I was in this church and I was preaching in church, and I was sitting on the front row with the pastor, and it was time for the offering. And I noticed that all of the ushers were junior high girls. And I said to the pastor, I said, that's interesting. Are you doing that today? Because I'm there. You know, is it like Mel Walker's there, so let's have a youth Sunday or something? And he said, no, it's really a cute story. He said a few weeks ago, he said the junior high girls went to the head usher and said to him, why is it always old men who are ushers? And the guy, I think, with real wisdom, in my church, when I'm home, I'm an usher, so... But the guy, I think, with real wisdom said, do you want to do it? And the girls said, yeah, we'd love to. And I'm sure probably it's in the church rule book that old men have to be ushers. That's probably a law somewhere. But in that church, the junior high girls became the ushers every single week. Tim's church, make sure that the ushers are intergenerational. Make sure. And they got white hairs with little kids. And I think that's a great idea. Again, I've said this several times. If I had my way, and that's one of the points in a minute, I would make it a law. Every ministry has to have a mentoring aspect. Number 3, provide specific opportunities for different generations to interact and have fellowship with each other. I was in a church recently that I think probably like a couple times a year, what they would do is have game night in the family room. That's all it was. They would set up round tables and bring out Monopoly and Parcheesi, or I don't know, and make sure that there would be old people and young people at every table, and they would encourage the senior citizens to tell their story. This is a generation, millennials, that are very wired for stories, and you have those in your church, and it's amazing that we let them go away. My life mission verse, I told you about that. Psalm 78, that the generation to come might know, that they might not forget the works of God. I love that. Get your old people a chance to tell their story. I remember years ago at Heritage, I was working with a youth group, and we had Glenn Capp. I don't know if you were there then, come down. Glenn Capp, one of the oldest guys in our church back then, Glenn Capp was now in heaven, flew bombers in World War II. And I didn't even know that until one deacons meeting, and we had him come share his story with his testimony. After D-Day, he flew bombing raids into France and Germany. And he's in heaven now, and and his wife. And it was just this amazing opportunity. And the kids were like, it was like real life Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan or whatever. This guy was a war. In fact, it was kind of cute because Glenn was nervous to go with teenagers. He was a legitimate World War II war hero, and he was scared of teenagers. But we gave him an opportunity, gave him about 20 minutes to share his story, and it was incredible. And if you have that opportunity, find out, check it out, vet them ahead of time, but give them an opportunity to tell their story. It will be amazing how, honestly, I'm going to use this word again, how revolutionary that will be. Here's another one. Develop intentional intergenerational mentoring connections. I believe in mentoring with all my heart. I wrote a little book for RBP that you can get from them, mentoring the next generation. I believe, and I'm going to talk about this for a minute, I believe that mentoring is different than discipleship. I think it's different. Jonathan talked about how they brought me out to their church, and I did this little mentoring conference. I think that discipleship is specific, intentional, it's educational, it's life. Mentoring is different. I don't think the National Network of Youth Ministry said that 90% of millennials, 9 out of 10, said they would love to have an adult mentor. And then as I've traveled, Peggy and I talking to churches about mentoring, I have found that the overwhelming number of baby boomers my age said they would love to be a mentor. But baby boomers often say, I don't have time. And so I think, here's the thing, I think here's the key for mentoring. Mentoring is not necessarily extra time. It's not. Mentoring is do what you do. Just do it with somebody younger. Mentoring is do what you do. Like come to church. Like hang out in the church foyer. I think the very best mentoring ever takes place, frankly, in the church foyer, where we encourage adults to be kind and talk to kids in the foyer where there's no threat, there's no problem, and talk to them. And, how'd algebra go? How many points did you get in the ball game last night, or whatever? That's the church-based mentoring is amazing. And again, I think that every ministry opportunity ought to have a mentoring aspect to it. Deacons, elders, whatever. Seriously, I think we're failing our mandate in the church because we don't do a good job at mentoring younger leaders. We kind of just yell at them and tell them to, and we don't know how to do that. And so I think developing intentional mentoring relationships in the church, I think, is huge. And I think in men's ministry, in women's ministry, or Titus 2, are ideal opportunities to help do that. Number 5, I told you this was down the list a little bit. Begin to provide ways. Begin to provide ways for different generations to pray with each other. With each other. In the beginning, that might be a threat. But after a while, after they're praying for each other, after they've talked in the foyer, after they've played Parcheesi together, whatever that is, and then they can pray. And honestly, it is amazing some of the intergenerational prayer meetings that I've had a chance to see around the country. It always, always, always blows me away. Did you ever pray with an old-timer and they kick into King James language? Even at my age, I want to say, dude, you don't talk like that, right? But there's something majestic. There's something awesome about old-timers praying. We had a guy, my home church, Bridgewater Baptist Church in Montrose, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. His name was Mr. Button. He's exactly what you think he looks like. He's exactly. When I was a kid, he'd pray at communion, or he was a layman. He'd pray at communion or whatever, and every single time, and I heard him pray often, every single time I would peek, because he sounded like God was right there talking to him. And he was. I was expecting to see. Did you ever pray with a kid? God, spit it out, right? There's something powerful about praying with kids. There's something powerful, there's something majestic about praying with old-timers. And we don't do it. Trends around the country. prayer meetings have died. Acts 12, church is in trouble. They gathered to pray. The youth group was there too. Rhoda, John Mark, and the intergenerational prayer. I was in a church out in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania where we live, and this is this most traditional church I've ever been in my life. I mean, it was conservative, probably legalistic or whatever. In fact, but years ago, they built this little church gym. And the first Wednesday night, they still do traditional prayer meeting, and they pray for Aunt Matilda's big toe or whatever. But and then they have youth group Wednesday nights too. And the youth group is out in this little gym they built, and the kids play games, and they have youth group. But the first Wednesday night of every quarter, they meet in the gym, and the pastor, it's hokey, I get that. It sounds like a dumb idea, but they do it. They line up the adults on one side of the gym, and they line up the teenagers on the other side of the gym. And the pastor says, go find somebody and pray. And the next 2 or 3 minutes are some of the most incredible church life things I have ever seen in my life, because you see real church happening through prayer, and it is amazing. It is amazing. And it is essential. Okay? Essential for the church. 6, provide significant ways for younger generations to serve alongside of older people. It is amazing to me how powerful that is. Just to serve alongside. I talked about family last night, and I hope that, that really was a specific intentional prayer of mine when I was raising my kids, is that our kids would see us, Peggy and I, serving the Lord together. In fact, that always bothered me. You know, when our kids were real little, we'd show up at church on Sunday morning, and Peg would go to one room, I'd go to a different room. And our kids are 2 years apart. Family planning, I'm sure. And they'd all go to different rooms, that whole age group thing. And so one of the things that's very important to me is that we're going to serve God together as a family. And there's something powerful. It's like, right? It's like osmosis happens. It's catching that serving God. And there's something amazing about that. And we have that perfect catalyst. We have that perfect laboratory for that. That's what the church is all about. And again, if I had my way, it would be a rule. It would be in the Constitution. That if you're going to be a deacon, you got to mentor somebody younger. If you're going to be in the sound room, you got to mentor somebody younger. If you're going to be an usher, if you're going to teach VBS, you have to. And I'm not sure how to pull that off. If I can figure out how to pull it off, I'll write that book and be a millionaire. But in the meantime, I'm just going to talk about it, and that is provide significant ways. And Tim Algrim taught me this, and that is what you don't want to do is dump the junk stuff that nobody else wants to do on the teenagers. Like you can't get adults to go to the nursing home, so you make the teenagers do that, and all the teenagers know no adults want to do this. Jeff, where are you? Right? Where's your button? If you weren't here for the workshop this morning, you missed a blessing, by the way. 7, recruit a team of encouraging and loving adults. That's the part maybe I should have underlined. Peggy and I have noticed something. We talk about it a lot, and I'm going to keep talking about it a lot. There are way too many discouragers out there in churches, aren't they? I love in Acts 11 where it says that Barnabas showed up and encouraged them all, often, probably once a year on Twitter. I write, I want to be that guy, because I do, that encouraged everybody. I want to be that guy. But I'm sick and tired of churches that discourage young people. Not them. But there are people in your church. There are them who love God, who want the church to succeed in the future, who love kids, who are loving, who are encouraging. Find them and actively welcome and get them. Develop a team. If you have to, organize it if you have to. But if not, just challenge people to do this. And that is every year when the kids graduate from high school, encourage a team of loving, active, godly, encouraging adults to just welcome them into the adult life of the church. Some kind of rite, R-I-T-E, of passage. And encourage them. Maybe it's a party, maybe it's a wilderness trip, maybe it's a social, maybe it's have everybody over at the house or whatever. But build that transition. On the website, there's a workshop notes where I talk about that transition more, and I could give you more, and there's more suggestions about that in the book, by the way. But that is huge. Chap Clark, who again we've had at our conference, he probably is the leading thinker, the leading voice in youth ministry today. In his book, Hurt, classic book, honestly, and Hurt 2.0 is out now too, so honestly, probably, I think probably the last 10 years, Hurt 2.0, probably the best youth ministry book. Make you think. But he says this, in most churches, when adolescents leave high school, there are few programmatic options available for them, much less a welcoming community that is committed to bring them into the life of the body. That 5 adults for every single kid type thing. So how are you doing in your church on a welcoming committee? How are you doing with that? That what our job is to encourage graduating high school kids. I think a typical church that I've been in, seriously, we stink at transitions. From children into youth ministry, from youth ministry into young adult, from young adult into the Fat 40s group. And then we're not very good at helping people transition out of the adults into the seniors groups either. We're not very good at that. We can't quite figure out how to do that. And so maybe just being intentional and finding those people who are welcoming and encouraging. I think there is a missing age group in church, the magic of Microsoft PowerPoint. And that is the young adults. And in the book, there are suggestions about young adult ministry, and I've been blogging about that and things as well. But that welcoming community idea, I think it's imperative. Now, here's the parentheses today. I want to share with you 13, I'm not kidding you, like machine gun things. I have thought about this, and what does youth ministry do right? When I first started my research, some of you reminded me that you were there during this process at different things. When I first started thinking about intergenerational ministry and those kinds of things, and I first started reading Barna and and Tom Rainier and those other guys who wrote about kids leaving the church, and all, my journey, probably 10 or so years ago, maybe even a few more than that. And I started talking about it in my workshops, and I remember I was in a church in Michigan, and I was talking to youth workers about kids are leaving the church after high school and stuff like that. And a youth pastor raised his hand at this point of the conversation and challenged my thinking that I actually put this in the book because I love what he said. And his question was this: Mel, do you think maybe that youth ministry has it right? And one of the reasons why kids hate big church is because youth ministry had it right. And then the big church needs to incorporate. And I've thought about that a lot over the years. Facetiously, when I was teaching at Faith and at BBC, I used to tell my students facetiously that if senior pastors ran their churches like youth pastors have to run their youth groups, we'd probably have growing churches all over the country. And I was somewhat facetious, and I'd smile a big Mel, cheesy grin. But I'm not sure I'm facetious. I'm not sure I am. Because I think youth workers have figured it out, that we have to reach culture, that we have to communicate, that we have to be real, that we have to be genuine. And maybe those are all things for big church to embrace. In fact, it bothers me. It really, really does. That in a lot of churches, I was in a denominational church out in the Midwest, the biggest church in that specific denomination. And it's a mega church, and they were building this new youth building, and all my friends were saying, Mel, you got to come look at this building. And the youth building was so big. The youth building was so big, and this is a monster church. The youth building was so big, the youth building had its own Starbucks, let alone big church. Big church had a mall in there. But I noticed that the building was as far away from the auditorium it was possible on their property. And frankly, that's what my experience is. As the teenagers are downstairs, the farthest away, and it seems like that we have done that intentionally. And maybe the youth ministry has some things. And so before you leave, and I let you leave, and I'm just saying, I'm not a guy that trashes the youth ministry. I think my burden is one philosophy throughout the ministry. But it just might look differently as we go through. So I want to talk with you about that. Donnie and I were talking even this week. In the book, there's a quick thing. I wanted to be objective in this, and I do think there might be some reasons why youth ministry does lead to a departure, and let me just share those with you quickly. I think if your youth ministry is activity-based, then chances are kids are going to grow up and walk away. In other words, when you become a young adult, right, the activities like going to the amusement parks and staying up and all of a sudden that becomes pretty, teenagers do that. That's not cool anymore. And so if that's been your ministry, there's likely, how are you going to keep that going in big church? Number two is if your youth ministry is program-based. The nature of the thing, you call up somebody in Chicago or New York or somewhere, and you have a program. Well, by the end of that, the program's done. You graduate. You get your last award. You get your last certificate. You get your scholarship or whatever. You're done. You're done. Okay, you quit going to church then? Oh, you graduated from church. No, I think kids are likely to walk away. And I think if your program is personality-based, when I was a youth pastor, I would have taught youth work. If I had thought of it, I would have taught workshops saying, don't be personality-based. Some of you have heard my story, and that is I was a youth pastor for several years, and on a Saturday, my senior pastor, probably the best friend I have ever had, got sick. Senior pastor got sick. He was old enough to be my dad, but an incredible mentor, an incredible discipler, someone who believed in me, someone who taught me about ministry. And on a Saturday, he got sick and drove himself to the hospital. By Monday morning, they told us it was acute leukemia, and he died 6 weeks later. The funeral was on a Friday. Our church is packed. Our church was booming in those days. The church was packed. Probably 1,000 people at his funeral. I had to officiate my own senior pastor's funeral. And my best friend, I didn't have to preach or anything like that, but I had to be that guy. And on Sunday morning, Friday was the funeral. On Sunday morning, I have to preach, and I'm thinking about what do I say, what do the people need. A very popular senior pastor just died, and I'm thinking about that. And the chairman of our deacons in our church asked to make an announcement. It never occurred to me that I ought to ask him, dude, what are you going to say? He gets up front and he says, this is the Sunday after the funeral. He gets up front and he says, the deacons met, and the deacons are recommending that Mel become the interim pastor of the church. All in favor, please say aye. And I'm looking over at Peggy, and I'm like, what's just happening here? And they all voted, unanimous. And he said, okay, Mel, thank you for doing that. Lord bless you as you preach. And I said, thank you very much. Please take your Bibles and turn to, and I didn't. There's no class in seminary or college about how to do that. And I became, in 1 minute of my life, I became the pastor of a church of about 800 people, and had to stay in my church and watch my youth ministry suffer a little bit because the personality was gone. That story is why intergenerational ministry is huge. You may be Superman. Maybe you can be the next walk-on-water guy and have all those skills. Maybe that's you. But if that is you, be careful. You're building your ministry around you. That's why you've got to. All right, Jax, you did it to me. Years ago, you had me and Travis be small group leaders together. Jax, I'm the guy who writes books. I'm the guy who mentored you, right? I'm the man, right? Absolutely not true, because my small group partner was my son, Travis. And I got to sit and watch my son minister to kids better than I ever did. Right? The importance of other adults in your ministry. That's huge to me. And I took more time than I wanted to on that one, but that makes sense why intergenerational ministry is important right there, right? Here's another one. It's narcissism-based. What this means is give the kids what you want. Tim, is that out there today? Tim, is that out there? My goodness, we talk about that. We see that all the time. Kids, you want to go skiing? Let's go skiing. You want to do all-nighters? Let's go all... Your philosophy ought to dictate that, not what kids want. That is incredibly fickle, by the way. And the world does that. And then the last one is if it's generational based. No wonder they walk away. All they know is kids of their own age. Okay? So what do we do right? Let me talk about that. What do we do right? There's 13 things. I believe with all my heart that youth workers have developed a philosophy of ministry that probably leads the way in church. My mentors in youth ministry, guys like Jack Wurtson of Word of Life, Dan Spader at Sun Life, Frank Hamrick even at Pro Teens, are guys that taught me, have a philosophy of youth ministry. Why do you do the things you do? And then how are you going to reach that goal? And my view is that the church ought to have one philosophy of ministry, but it looks different in the different age groups. Number two, I think youth workers do a better job at understanding an educational strategy. What I mean by that is the old Christian ed scope and sequence. Here's why I think young youth pastors figure this out. You get 7th graders, and 6 years from now they graduate from high school. What do they need to know by the time they graduate? The danger of youth ministry is that it's a terminal program. They leave you. The great thing about youth ministry, it's a terminal program. It shows you. Okay, here's the thing. I teach a class at Baptist Bible Seminary for youth pastors on how to write curriculum because I did that 10 years of my life. I mean, I did that. By the time they graduate from high school, have they studied the whole Bible? Do you care? Do you even know? And that's been my burden about this juvenilization thing of American church. I talked to you about that the other night. Tom Bergler, read those books. Is as the church becomes a show on Sunday morning, if that's all there is, then how are we teaching kids the whole counsel of God? Now, here's the thing about that. I think youth pastors have figured it out because it's terminal, right? That there is an ending point, so I need to prepare them for adulthood. All right, so let me just play the devil's advocate thing for a minute. How many years does it take an adult in your church to get all the way through the Bible? If we believe in Ephesians 4, then we're going to equip them. How do you know when that's done? Here's another one, the Great Commission, Matthew 28. How do you know? How do you know if they can observe to do all the commands of Christ? Do you even know what they are? Do your people know all that Christ has commanded you to do? And do they know how to implement them in life? That scope and sequence. I remember the days. I was a youth pastor. This is before any computer or whatever. I went to the office supply store and bought a poster board and got a ruler and made the little pencil marks and had all of that. And okay, fall 7th graders, they're going to get this. Fall 8th graders, they're going to get this. And fall 9th graders, and had that chart that I made in my office so that I would know. These are the things that I want the kids to know by the time they're done. And frankly, I think youth workers, I wish pastors would embrace that strategy, an educational strategy, so that we know, are we producing fully devoted followers of Christ? Do we know? Here's another one, spiritual disciplines. I've wondered, I need to do this quicker and to be able to get done, but this is a big one to me. Jeff talked about that this morning. I'm in a lot of churches. I average for the last, tons of years, about 30 churches a year I visit. And I love to visit churches, and when I'm in churches, sometimes I get a chance to look at church closets. I do. I love to visit the ghost of youth ministry past, and to see these are things, and have churches tell me, well, we used to do this and it doesn't work, and we used to do this program and it doesn't work, or whatever, and then realize there's churches right around the corner that do the same program and it's booming, so what's the difference? I think probably the difference is philosophy, but I love this one. And I'm not ripping, I'm promoting it, I am. Churches that have Awana. I always like to ask church leaders, why do you have Awana, or any kind of children's ministry? I love this. I really do. And the number one reason that people have, and Awana, by the way, right now is doing some reevaluation and retooling, and it's kind of exciting to me that there is a ministry that was launched with World War II generation, that it's cool to wear uniforms and have badges and all of that they're finally figuring out that ain't cool no more, And so I applaud them for this. But I always ask churches, why do you have Awana? And what's the number one reason? Why would churches have a children's ministry? What's the number one reason? What? Scripture memory. We want our kids to memorize Scripture, right? We want our kids to memorize Scripture. That's important to us. We rally the flag. We have Awana. We want our kids to memorize Scripture. And in all of that, I got the joke. Don't worry about it. I caught myself. I caught myself on that one. Flag! Why do we do that? We want our kids to memorize Scripture. Oh, really? Oh, really? When was the last time you had your adults memorize Scripture? Sounds pretty hypocritical to me. You're going to tell kids it's important, but it's not important enough for me to do it? Sounds hypocritical. Then we have youth ministry. And we tell our teenagers, and we have Jeff Beckley come in and do a seminar, and we've got to get our kids into Scriptures, and we've got to do things like On Track or Word of Life Quiet Time and so on. And we tell our kids, we put devotionals on the table, and we tell them, when's the last time you talked to adults about having daily devotions, daily quiet time? Sounds pretty hypocritical. If we want our kids, it better be intergenerational, and youth ministry has led the way on spiritual disciplines. And it hits me that that better be a church-wide philosophy. I think another one that youth ministry has led the way, we talked about that last night, parental involvement. I think youth workers understand we better get the parents involved. I think youth workers understand that, and probably we're failing if we don't, so we're not going to talk about that much. Here's another one. I think youth workers understand the deal about lifetime commitments. I talked about the history of youth ministry, and that's how we all got started. You know, Billy Graham asking people to come forward in those rallies in Madison Square Garden, and us going to camp. And that's why the majority of decisions, of life decisions, happen as teenagers in camp. And man, I love that. Okay, when was the last time we challenged adults to make a decision right now for the rest of your life, to make a commitment? We do that to kids and don't do that to adults. That seems pretty hypocritical to me. Oh, here's what we think. We give adults notebooks. We do. We give adults notebooks, and we tell them, write this down. Someday you'll use it. No, you won't. Adults can. That's why I'm 60 years old. I would rather preach to teenagers than any other group ever still at my age, because teenagers understand if you challenge them now, they get it. They're going to do it now. Adults think, someday I'll look at it. You're a liar. We won't. We process. We put it off. And I think youth ministry has it right. I think youth ministry understands. Jeff talked about this verse, James 1:20, be doers of the word and not hearers only. I think adults here someday do this. Teenagers, let's do it now. Number 6, I think one of the things that youth ministry has led the way, praise God for genuine worship. The worship movements of Passion or Chris Tomlin or those kinds of things has led to a resurgence of worship. And then, but you look back in the history, doing the book I read, because I grew up in this era. I read that Percy Crawford's biography, the Young People's Church of the Air, and back then the youth chorus books. And those kinds of things. And maybe historically youth ministry has led the way, and I'm thankful. I think youth ministry has led the way with big church to honor worship. Real worship, not just a show, not just light show and smoke and not that, but real worship. I think youth ministry has led the way on that. I think another one, I think youth ministry has led the way on time away from life, camping and retreats. These guys aren't paying me to say that. Dave, we didn't have a talk about this, right? I think youth pastors understand it's good to get kids out of Dodge. It's good to get them away from media and take them to an island where there's no cell phone service. That's not true, but I mean, get them away from that. Get them, not us, right? Yeah. Get them away from that, where the media and life and home and those kind. Christ did that with his disciples, and I wonder, why don't we do that much with big church? I wonder that. I think Christ modeled that for us, and I think that's more powerful. Get them out of Dodge and get them in nature. I don't model this much. I get that, but every fall comes around, and the Monday after Thanksgiving, I go deer hunting. I think the only reason I did it is because my dad did it, but and I'm not very good at it. But it's very good for me to sit in the woods without my phone sometimes and pray and think and see nature and every now and then shoot Bambi. But That's time away, and I've wondered about that, and wondered why big church hasn't embraced, and some are, certainly. Here's another one. I think youth ministry understands fellowship with peers. I think all of us love that. Kids love getting together with other kids, right? One of the things I've noticed is how in the church, the 21st century church, fellowship is de-emphasized, hanging out with each other. I think small groups maybe, but all that does is create a little clique maybe, and we don't have fellowship. We don't do the church suppers where my dad, the Jim Walkers of life, would show up and throw away the dirty tablecloths and get to know people that you don't know very well. And, we have 4 or 5 services on Sunday. You don't get to know people. And youth ministry, I think youth workers understand it's good to get kids together. You go to camp, you go to Teen Leadership Conference, you go to New Hope. It's good for kids to get together with other Christian kids and to meet non-Christian kids. That's a very good thing, and that brings us to the next one. I think the history of youth ministry has taught us. I think youth workers understand evangelism. We've got to reach kids for Christ. 90% of kids, 90% of people in America, according to Dave Ron, 90% of people in America, I got saved when I was 5 years old, Child Evangelism Fellowship. 90% of people in America get saved before they're 18. I think we understand we've got to reach kids for Christ. How many of you youth pastors have ever done coaching or any involvement in a public school? Raise your hand. See, I think we get that it's imperative to reach our community, and the way you do that is through the high schools and to every high school in America. By the way, every high school has budget problems. Whatever it is that you do, you can probably volunteer and get an in the high school to do that. And it's amazing to me. Tim with coaching, Jason with coaching. Don does purity talks in public high schools. He volunteers for that. And now he's on the agenda for that. It's amazing. Brian Wagner helped us start Vision for Youth. He was the first guy I knew that knew how to do desktop publishing with PageMaker and all of that. So he volunteered. He wasn't going to go, coach the football team. That's not Brian. But he volunteered to be the yearbook advisor, didn't he, Tim? Amazing opportunity because he knew how to do desktop publishing, evangelistic opportunities, and to have events to share the gospel. I think another one is, I think youth pastors understand the importance of ministry and service. Church isn't just come to a lecture on Sunday mornings. And so we take kids on missions trips and we have kids do work days. And our churches do that as well. But I think youth ministry has led the way. I think another one that youth ministry has led the way on is accountability. I think youth pastors understand. That positive peer pressure is a good thing. That there's something that is incredibly special in youth ministry where it becomes the thing to do here is the right thing. That what we do here, Dwight Peterson, Luke, your dad taught me that more than anybody else, that what we do here in our youth group, if you're going to come to youth group at First Baptist Church, what you're going to do is you're going to do devotions. And that it kicked in. It's like, okay, I'm going to do that. Or where it's outreach, or it's where it's go to this thing or whatever. It's amazing how that works in youth ministry. And I think that accountability, and that is we're part of a body. We are accountable. And when we hurt we do hurt other people. What I do hurts other people. And I think youth ministry has done a better job at that, frankly, than big church. I think another one is, I think most youth pastors understand life-related discipleship. I've been tweeting about this as well. I think what we do in big church is say discipleship is a class on Sunday afternoon. And I think youth pastors have done a great job at saying, no, discipleship is life. Discipleship is time. Discipleship is I'm going to hang out with you and spend time. And there's going to be an agenda to that. And no matter what Mike Yaconelli said, I believe in discipleship. And I believe that 2 Timothy 2:2 works. In my ministry, I looked for 2 Timothy 2:2 kids, by the way, who are faithful and have the ability to teach others also. And I'm going to invest my life in that kind of kid. I am. Find 2 Timothy 2:2 kids. Those who are faithful. And the Bible says, he that's faithful in least should be faithful in much. Find kids who are faithful in little things and have the ability to teach others. Those are amazing. Those are world changer kids. Disciple that kind of kid. And the last one is I think youth workers understand. I think youth workers understand the importance of intergenerational connections. That's why we recruit a team to work with us. I think youth ministry has led the way. It is very good for teenagers, no matter what the world says. The world says be careful of adults who like kids, frankly. And youth workers understand that kids need godly adults. And I think youth workers understand, like I talked about with me and Travis before, I think youth workers understand that personality-based thing. I think youth workers understand that you can't impact everybody. That you need other models. I love that Proverbs. I love that Proverbs where it talks about a multitude of counselors. I love that. That the body of Christ is everybody working together, and that's why get other personalities. And I'll tell you a trend that I noticed around the country, and this is an intergenerational plug, and that is don't recruit people just like you to be youth leaders. Recruit people different than you, with different skill set, different ages than you, different life experiences. Get some that are married, some that are single, some that are old, some that are young, some that, different models of youth workers, because they'll minister to kids that you can't minister to. So my question, and you can look at page 25 and 26, is how can the church develop and integrate positive aspects of youth ministry? And those are at least 13 of them. My advice on that, and then we're going to wind down. My advice on that is those are the things, the 13 things, that if you can model them and show them to big church, that they'll see the value, that these are things that youth ministry does very, very well. All of those charts, I talked about that. So how do we change the paradigm? Let's wind down and we're going to be done. All right? Changing the paradigm, how do we change from age-segregated to intergenerational church? I think it starts by, let me talk about that. A paradigm shift is a change of thinking, and that's all I'm asking you to do in this workshop, is to think about intergenerational connections. So how do you change, or why change, first of all? Number one, I think you have to be convinced it's the right thing. Number one is have a biblical conviction of the importance of developing healthy and growing intergenerational connections. That's why the Bible studies are in the notes. Do you believe the Bible teaches intergenerational connections? If it's a conviction, then why aren't we doing that? Number two, I think we also have to look in the face, and that is there's an epidemic. And that is our kids are walking away, and what are we going to do? Are we going to let that happen? And my prayer is, me personally, and also everything, what I do and say and write is I want to challenge people for that. And then number three, I think we have to have a goal for balance, which is what I put this in the book. And that is, I think we have to have a goal for balance. And that is, I just gave you 13 things that are very, 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 very good about youth ministry. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's how I ended the book. We're doing a lot of things right. Let's build those things and let's demonstrate that we're doing those things right. But let's balance the importance of intergenerational connections and peer ministry. And so I want to end by just talking with you a little bit about how to do that. Number one, my advice is pray and search the Scriptures. Don't go home, and talk to your senior pastor tomorrow. Mel says, I don't want those phone calls. No, it's okay. That's fine with me. But what do you think God wants you to do? Don't ever, Mel says, that means nothing. What does God say? Start there. I think that's important. Number two is do whatever you can to motivate. That's where I start, motivate, and then train your church's leadership team. And I'm not talking about a new program. I'm just talking about, be excited about intergenerational connections and do what you can within your sphere of influence to work with a leadership team. Okay, so the question is, well, what if you don't have access to those guys? Okay, start with your leadership team. Okay, maybe you can't go into the next elders meeting and say, now listen, here's what we're going to... Maybe you don't have that role, but you have a team. Get your youth leaders, get your small group leaders and say, okay, here's where we're headed, and here's why. Then you can get out Mel's notes and talk to him about some of those things. 3, establish a church-wide intergenerational philosophy. Show your senior pastor the videos or give them my book. I'll sell it to you at a discount. And talk about why this is important. And establish a philosophy that what we're going to do here is we're not going to segregate by race or social structure, and we're not going to segregate by age only. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. I believe in youth ministry, but there's a balance, and that has to be a church-wide balance. Next, I think, I talked to you about this last night, equip parents to be a success, spiritual success. Intergenerational ministry seems to me to happen best within a family structure because you've already got the mechanism, the parents involved and the parents' friends. But I think you're going to have a sell job on that. I asked you about that last night. You are going to have parents who don't trust you. You are going to have parents, the way it's going, you are going to have parents that don't want to send their kids to your youth groups because they think any other influence is bad. And you're going to have dysfunctional parents. Believe me, you are. So you're going to have your hands full. But that doesn't mean it's not right. And that's equip parents. It's hard. It's really, really hard. But to raise up a generation of parents who are on your side and so on, that's huge. Another one is start slowly. Start slowly. And begin by asking significant people to begin that process. Start slowly. And begin. How do you do? Don't go home and say, okay, all of a sudden, here's what we're going to do that. But here's what you do, is get key people involved and get them to be mentors. I believe in mentoring. I believe in youth leaders and small group leaders. I think mentoring can be another whole level of intergenerational connections. And I write about that in that little booklet. And there's a chapter in this book about mentoring as well and how that works. And some of us here have done a lot of work about that. But that's how it starts, and that is get significant people involved and get them to involve in the process. And then certainly, where do you start? Start old, start young. But encouraging emerging generations. Let's change the future. Let's change the future. And the way to do that is by starting young. Let's change the future, and let's encourage, let's model intergenerational ministry so that the future is different than the traditions. I talked to you about that the very first day than we have now. Let's shatter this segregated thing and realize the church is one thing, one body. But it's all about reproducing in the lives of the next generation. Here's another. You can go home and begin intentional mentoring. That deal about ministry leaders and stuff, you can do that. Even if nobody else is doing that, you do that. Take every opportunity to build into the life by being a mentor. Start in the foyer. Do what you do. Just do it with somebody younger. And then encourage other people to do that too. Just start talking about it. Preach on Titus 2 if you can. Preach on 1 Thessalonians 2. Those key passages that talk about that. And I think another one is expect intergenerational serving. I said if I had my way, I'd make it a law. I don't know how to do that. But I think we can start to expect, and we're going to model that in the youth ministry, or we're going to model that in VBS, or we're going to model that on the missions trips. And I know you have to do that within guidelines and so on, but expect that and start with the things that you can. Start with things that are easy. I think things like the greeters and the ushers and those kinds of things are an easy start in most churches because you're begging people to do that. Another one, be consistent about developing or about building a total church loyalty. I'm not going to make too big a deal about this because I don't want to, but it is a danger. I'm just telling you it is. If your kids are more loyal to the youth group than they are to big church, at some point that's going to be a problem. And so how to do that, I think things like talk to them about church, encourage them to tithe, encourage them to get baptized. That's in the Great Commission. Encourage them to become members. Encourage them to fulfill the responsibility of members, whatever that is in your church discipline, whatever that is. And don't just make it easy for kids. I think we've got to raise the bar. Christ said, you follow me, you pick up your cross. Raise the bar. I think this generation, Tim's article about busy kids, I think this generation, I think there's going to be, I'm not a prophet, but I think there's going to be a huge pendulum. I really do. And that is we've made church fluff. We've made it a show on Sunday morning, and I think people are going to be fed up with that. And I think around the country, that's why there's a drive back to liturgy and seriousness. And I'm praying that there will be a drive back to this is serious, and so raise the bar. And Christ requires something of me to be a disciple of Christ. He does. And it's not just fluff. Make it hard. So you work with busy kids. You work with athletes. They can't come to your thing because they got basketball practice. Then do something early morning. They're the kind of kids who will get up early because they're disciplined kids. That's exactly what Tim's article says. They're the kids that you say, I'm going to do this extra. They're the kind of kids that says, I'm in. If it's serious, I'm coming. If you say it's not serious, I'm not going to worry about that. But if you say it's serious, that you're willing to get up early, you're willing to spend the extra time, you're willing to do this, and so am I. I'm in. I want to be a part of that, right? That's what this generation is. And so it costs something to be a follower of Christ. We've told people it doesn't. The easy believism garbage. Am I railing? Okay. Amen. There's 7 things. Specific ways. You guys do this well. Find adult youth leaders. Recruit teams that are different than you. Number 2, have adult-led small groups. If I had my way, I'd work on intergenerational small groups. And I have some concerns, and we can talk about that privately, but that's a way to have intergenerational connections. Another one is mentoring. Number 4 is intergenerational ministry, the serving back and forth. Another one is get godly adults to share their story. That's big. Get other adults to come down to youth group. Other adults just share their story. It's amazing how that will connect. Encourage intergenerational fellowship. Have a dinner, have game night. Encourage that, and then give exposure to other generations. And let no man despise your youth. Give exposure, and to do those things, I think we can encourage intergenerational connections. I ended the book, and I'm ending, to Him be the glory in the church throughout all generations. And I believe that's, as Christ tarries, that's our mission and that's our responsibility, and I think these are ways we can do that.